Okay, well, maybe we won't wait too long for everybody. So happy Inauguration Day to you all. I'm planning on giving you and me a little bit of an inauguration present today. So my idea is I think we can get done what we need to get done this morning. And so let's have class this morning, and then it's kind of a midweek break. We won't have class this afternoon. Okay, so that will be a good time for you to not only celebrate the inauguration or take a nap, as the case might be, or catch up on your reading or get ahead of your reading or all these kind of things. So yeah, so I think we can get by here just with, an hour and 45, or we might go a little bit longer than that, but I think we should be able to get this done in a couple of hours this morning. And so we'll take a little break. Okay, so Kira, you're just getting on here, but we won't have class this afternoon. Okay, so it's a little inauguration present. So what are we going to do today? I thought we would really do three things. We're going to talk about, maybe just review a little bit of what we talked about yesterday about technology in the SOLO model. We'll talk about talk about convergence in the SOLO model. We will talk about that Easterly reading, right? And kind of put the SOLO model in some context. And then we'll talk a little bit about growth accounting, right? Which is basically empirically, how do we think about how important technology and productivity is to why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. So, all right, to begin with, does anybody have any questions about what we talked about yesterday afternoon with regards to adding technology to the SOLO model? I mean, I didn't know if anybody wanted me to go through some things, if on review some of that made sense, if it's still a little unclear. I mean, if we can spend maybe just a minute or two reviewing. Remember what we talked about yesterday when we were talking about technology in the SOLO model. And how we added technology, if you remember, is we added this A bar, right? And A bar grows exponentially. Okay? So A here is exogenous productivity. Right? Exogenous productivity, or sometimes I'll refer to it as technology, right? It just comes to us. The SOLO model has no explanation for why productivity occurs, but it happens, right? We figure things out, we get better at doing things, and so now there's a way of increasing output without increasing inputs, okay? So now you can increase output by increasing your inputs like capital and labor, but you can also increase output by increasing your productivity. And so what we showed yesterday is now there's a balanced growth path. And along this balanced growth path, what's true? That output and per capita capital grow at the rate of G, while the level of output and the level of capital grow at the rate of G plus N. So now we have a balanced growth path, not a steady state. Because a steady state is where levels were constant in the long run. A balanced growth path is when growth rates are constant in the long run, right? So in the simple model that we talked about in the first part of class yesterday, what's steady in the long run is the level of output, the level of per capita output. Here, what's steady in the long run is the growth rate of per capita output, right? The growth rate of per capita output is G. But as we know, you can grow faster or slower than G depending upon where you are relative to the balanced growth path. So if you're below the balanced growth path, you can grow faster. If you're above, you can grow slower. Now, the problem with this model is that because per capita output, they're not stationary, right? In other words, they're not constant in the long run. And that makes it hard to graph. So if you remember what we talked about yesterday afternoon, we did this trick where we defined a new variable that's stationary. Right? And stationary variables have the tilde on top of them. And so we defined, sorry, there should be little y tilde as capital Y divided by A times L. So instead of just dividing by L, which is little y, we divide by A times L, which is little y tilde. And we defined little k tilde. So these variables are going to be stationary. They're going to be constant along the balanced growth path. And that allows us to graph them. And so what we showed is that if we rewrite the model in terms of these tildes, we showed yesterday afternoon that you can rewrite the model like this. Okay. You can rewrite the model in terms of tildes. I have really bad tildes as I look at my writing here. I don't know if those are tildes or upside down U's or frowny faces or smiley faces, but yeah, they're tildes. At least they're intended to be. And so the big things that are different here is, of course, we've had the tildes, but now notice relative to before, G bar shows up in here because now we have technology growth. So our Solow diagram now looks like this. Where now we have a balanced growth path. Okay, not a steady state, but a balanced growth path. And it's that point where S bar times K tilde, meaning the first part of this equation up here, is equal to the second part of that equation, so that we have so that the change in K tilde is equal to 0. And that's our balanced growth path of capital. Okay? So now we have a model. Do you have a question? Yeah, sure.
So if we increase G bar, the rate of technological growth, does that decrease K tilde?
Ah, okay. Good question, Chase. Good question. Okay. I'm glad you asked this question because I think that question is really getting at the heart of why this can be confusing. So your question is, what happens if G bar goes up? Why did I do that? Sorry. Okay. So what if G bar goes up? You're right, Chase. Actually, what happens if G bar goes up, this gets steeper. And it appears that our balanced growth path goes down, right? That doesn't seem intuitive. And it's not really intuitive. But you have to remember, what is K tilde? It's this, right? So when you have an increase in G, it's increasing A, and that reduces K tilde. But the thing that we need to keep in your mind is, do we really care about K tilde? No. The question is, what happens to little k? Little k actually goes up, and little y go up, right? Because remember, right, well, A goes up, that reduces K tilde, but when A goes up, that increases K and Y, okay? So an increase in A increases capital to labor ratio, it increases per capita output, but it actually reduces K tilde. And so that's counterintuitive, right? So that's why you asked a good question, right? It doesn't seem to make sense until you think about what's really happening here. So, you know, as I said yesterday, right? One thing to kind of keep this straight is just to remember that along the balanced growth path, all of these variables are growing at different rates. The tilde variables are not growing, they're stationary. But remember, we don't really care about this, right? I mean, we care from a perspective of being able to graph it, but that's not from a policy perspective or from a welfare perspective, that's not what we care about. What we care about is this. And that's going to grow at the rate of G. So if G bar goes up, these things are going to have to go up. These per capita variables have to go up. And then finally, what about just the levels of output? They're growing at the rate of N plus G. So if this doesn't make sense to you, okay, you need to spend some time thinking about it this afternoon. Right? Because this is really at the key to understanding this model, is that we really have different variables and they're all growing at different rates, right? So we need to make sure that we understand what grows at what rate along the balanced growth path. Importantly though, because we're most concerned with per capita variables, this is what we're most concerned from a policy or a welfare perspective, is what's happening to these, right? And in the long run, per capita output is going up by G, right? Along the balanced growth path. So let's do an example here. I did an example yesterday afternoon about a change in the savings rate. Let's do an example here. Let's say there's a rise. No, let's do a fall. No, let's do a rise. I'm indecisive this morning. Let's say that there's a rise in N bar. In other words, there's an increase in population. How's that going to impact our model? So here's our solo diagram. And I also want to do a diagram like we had yesterday, where we're going to look at the growth of output, per capita output over time. And then we're also going to look at the log of the level of output over time. So remember, by taking the log here, we're talking about things on a ratio scale. So what happens before we have this change? Output is growing at G. And in logarithmic forms, the log of Y is just going up in a straight line. Okay. Okay, now, what happens when we have an increase in N? An increase in N shifts this curve in this direction. And we have a new balanced growth path. Notice that this new balanced growth path is lower than the one before. What does it mean to have a lower balanced growth path? Well, let's think about this. Remember that we're not going to just jump to this new balanced growth path. We're going to transition here over time. So what essentially happens here as we transition to a lower level of output growth in the long run? What happens is that growth actually falls below G bar, right? In other words, we have lower growth because we're above the balanced growth path. But as we transition back, or as we transition to the new balanced growth path, growth will go back up to G bar in the long run. What does this mean for the level of output? Oops. What does this mean for the level of output? What this means is that, this is really kind of hard for me to draw, but it means that output is actually going to grow slower for a period of time, but then in the long run, it will go back to the same slope. It will go back to the same rate of growth. But notice, because we grew slower for a period of time, we will be poor. So in the long run, we're poor on a per capita basis. In the short run, we grow slower. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? You know, as I said, I think one of the things that having a dynamic model is really asking us to do is think in 3 dimensions as opposed to 2, right? So in most of our economics classes, we've just thought in 2 dimensions, right? It's just like the level of output, the level of the prices, the quantities, levels. Now, the fact that we've added time to our analysis means that we have to think about changes over time, meaning growth rates. And so it is a little bit like thinking in 3 dimensions, right? You have to think about not just where things are now, but where things are going to change over time. And it just takes a little practice, right? It takes a little practice. And so, like I said, um, given we don't have class this afternoon, for those of you who still feel a little shaky on this, this would be a good time to go back and really review this, because as I said, this is really important to understanding a lot of the things that we talk about going on. All right. So hopefully the few minutes that we spent here this morning going over what we talked about yesterday afternoon, hopefully you get a little bit more comfortable with this. All right, get a little bit more comfortable with this. Okay, I want to move on to a new topic here and talk about convergence. And convergence really refers to this question. Are per capita income levels across countries getting closer together over time? The Solow model predicts a form of convergence. We could call it conditional convergence. It does predict convergence, but there's a condition. And the condition is you must have the same G bar, N bar, S bar. In other words, you have to have the same exogenous variables. You have to have the same balanced growth path. If two countries have the same balanced growth path, they will converge over time. So just to kind of think about a diagram, let's say that two countries have the same balanced growth path. This is the balanced growth path for both country A and B. But country A is down here, country B is right here. So country B is richer than country A, but they have the same balanced growth path. So what's going to happen over time? A grows faster than B. And over time, they will converge. So you think about how this would play out over time is that B is going up, but remember, because B is richer, it's growing slowly. And A is poor, so it's going to grow faster, right? And so, you play this out over time, and eventually, right at the finish line, B is going to catch up, right? The closer you get to that balanced growth path, the more that the income levels between these countries converge. So the Solow model does predict convergence, but very, very importantly, I have to emphasize this. It's conditional convergence. Will you have convergence if two countries don't have the same balanced growth path? No, you won't, right? So the alternative to this would be, let's think about a graph in which one country A, has this savings rate. And so that's their balanced growth path. But another country, country B, has a lower savings rate. And so this is their balanced growth path. Will they converge? No. No. B will remain permanently poorer than A. Okay, so the Solow model does not predict absolute convergence. It does not predict that every country in the world is going to converge. It predicts conditional convergence. And why? Diminishing marginal returns. That's really why you get conditional convergence in the Solow model, right? Because what does diminishing marginal returns say? Poor countries grow faster than richer countries, ceteris paribus. Right? In other words, everything else being equal, meaning you have the same balanced growth path, everything else being equal, a poor country will grow faster than a richer country. Do we observe convergence in the real world? Well, kind of, which is probably the answer to most questions in economics. Yes and no, maybe, right? Maybe. Let's look at a little bit of data here. Hold on, sorry. Thought I had this pulled up. Okay. Damn. The screen sharing is so awkward. All right. Here we go. So this is looking at what we can call a convergence graph. So what is a convergence graph? It's looking at how rich you were in the past versus how fast you've grown since that time. So the horizontal axis here is per capita GDP all the way back in 1870. Okay, so 150 years ago, what was a country's per capita GDP? And then the vertical axis is how fast the country has grown since that time. The negative relationship here is convergence. Why? Because what's true about the countries that were rich in 1870? They've grown the slowest since 1870. And the countries that were the poorest in 1870 have grown the fastest. However, let me tell you about the countries in this graph. This is only OECD countries, meaning this is only rich countries. If you look among rich countries, you see convergence. Should that be completely surprising to us? Probably not, because that probably means if they're rich, they have similar balanced growth paths, right? And so it's not completely surprising that there's convergence here. You can see convergence in this graph as well. This is looking at the US, UK, Germany, and Japan. Look at the amount of convergence that's taken place here over the last 140 years, right? Income levels have gotten a lot more close together, right? Convergence hasn't been unending, right? Particularly, you notice during World War II, there was a lot of divergence, but pretty much outside of World War II, there's been this strong process of convergence. Look what happens if you look among emerging market economies. Right, I'm going to find a graph here. Yes, okay, this is the graph I wanted to show you. So this is looking at emerging market economies since the year 2000. So once again, the horizontal axis is how rich you were in 2000, and then the vertical axis is how fast you've grown since 2000. Once again, we see a negative relationship, convergence. The countries that were the poorest in 2000 among this group have grown the fastest, like Myanmar, and the countries that were the richest in 2000, like Chile and Hungary, have grown the slowest. Convergence, right? However, let's not get carried away. The problem with this graph and the other graphs I showed you is that there's a selection bias here. And the selection bias is if we pick countries that are rich today, we know that they're rich today. How did they get rich? They had to grow fast in the past. And if they were poor in the past, that means they've had to grow fast to catch up to be rich today, right? So by picking rich countries today and looking for convergence, well, of course there's going to be convergence. If they're rich, they had to grow fast in the past, right? And if they began poor, they've had to grow faster. It's the classic selection bias, right? Who you select is really showing you that there's going to be convergence. Same for emerging market economies. Emerging market economies are economies that are growing. So surprise, surprise, countries that have made it to the threshold of being emerging markets have been growing. What's going to be true about the countries that were the poorest but made it into this class of emerging markets? They've had to grow the fastest to make it into this group. So to kind of pick and choose countries and say, well, here's some convergence, that's not really surprising. What we really have to do is we have to look at, well, what if we look at the rest of the world? And if you look at the rest of the world, you're going to find that the evidence for convergence is not nearly so strong. And so this is figure 3.6, where we put basically the whole world on this convergence graph. Does this look like convergence? Not nearly as much. I mean, it's true. If you look up here at the countries with the fastest growth rates, right, there does appear to be some sort of negative relationship between how rich you were in 1960 and how fast you've grown since then. Diminishing marginal returns is a real thing, okay? We're not saying that diminishing marginal returns doesn't hold, but look at all these countries down here near the origin, right? Basically, why convergence is not really happening at a world level is that there are a lot of countries that were poor in 1960 and have not grown since 1960. So while there are countries that are poor and have grown, those countries have converged. But there are also countries that are poor in 1960 and have not grown. How do we understand these countries in the Solow model? We understand them in this way. Those countries are already at their balanced growth path. It's just a very, very low balanced growth path, right? So these are countries that have low savings rates, high population growth, low technology growth, and are just stuck in the trap of having low balanced growth paths. And so they have not converged, and there's no reason to think that they will converge until something happens to change those conditions. right? So until something happens to change their savings rates, to change their population growth, to change technology growth in these countries, they will not converge. So in other words, until they become growth miracles, they're not going to converge. And so that's really what we have in many ways when you look at the world, is we have a world in which some countries are converging and other countries are not, right? So, for instance, if you look here in figure 3.9 from your book, this is the income ratio of the countries that are the richest 10% relative to the countries in the poorest 10%. Okay? And notice that the poorest 10% have really caught up with the richest 10%. That's good news, right? This is good news. The bottom 10% in some sense are catching up with the top 10%. But, the bad, and as we talked about, there's also good news, is that more of the world is living at higher income levels. But what's the reason for this graph and what's the reason for this graph? China and India. Okay? So, in other words, if we look at things, if I can go back here to this, if we go back to this graph, when we look at the whole world and our unit of observation is countries, we're not really seeing a lot of convergence country by country. Some, but not a lot. Why? Because there's a lot of small countries that are not converging, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has there's 52 countries in Africa, I think, 52, 53. And most of those countries are in the poorest 5% of countries in the world, right? And so a lot of these countries here in the origin are African, or there's some Middle Eastern countries that are just trapped in poverty, right? And they are not converging. But if you weigh the fact that China and India are converging and there's so much of the world's population, then you get this, right? That more of the world is living at a higher level of GDP. So I guess another way of saying this is that the evidence of convergence looks a lot stronger for individuals than it does for countries. At an individual level, it is true that there's never been a time in world history that's been a better time to be a poor person, right? The poorest of the poor are doing better. But that largely is because a lot of the very poor have lived in China and India, right? And so given the dramatic growth that's occurred in China and India over the last 30 or 40 years, they're doing much better. The disappointing thing is that if you look at a number of countries, though, outside of China and India that are poor, once again, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we just are not seeing a lot of convergence, right? Which suggests that they're stuck in a very low balanced growth path. So that's kind of convergence, right? That's convergence. Before we take a break, let's talk a little bit about this Easterly reading that I had you read, all right? So changing gears here. So I wanted you to take a look at this Easterly reading because I think in part, really I wanted you to think about putting the Solow model in some context. Okay. Aid for investment. So Easterly begins by talking about another model of economic growth that was quite widely adhered to in the 1960s, called the Harrod-Domar financing gap model. Anybody want to explain for me or summarize what were some of the important insights or claims of the Harrod-Dormer financing gap model?
That you can get, like, there's a direct relationship between growth in GDP and the rate of investment. And so you have to have financial aid because poor countries don't have enough investment themselves, so they have to get aid from other countries to like fill this investment gap.
Exactly. Very well said, Max, right? Basically, how do you increase growth? Increase investment. In fact, it's even a little bit more predictive than that. If you increase investment by 4 times, how much will growth go up by? 4 times. So if I want to double my rate of growth, I just double my rate of investment. If I want to quadruple my rate of growth, I quadruple my rate of investment. And so Max said the policy implications of this were pretty clear. First off, try to accumulate, what poor countries need to do is try to accumulate financial aid. Right? Try to get those big loans from the World Bank. What were some of the other policy implications of this? Of course, try to get it from other people, right? If you can't get it from other people, what can you do domestically?
Like public investment through like taxes and stuff.
Right. And where do you get that money for public investment?
Through taxes.
Through taxes and through forced savings, right? So part of this was forced savings and cutting consumption, meaning cut people's standards of living so that you can invest more.
Can you go into what forced savings exactly means? I wasn't really clear what that meant in the reading.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second, let me just write this. Okay. So forced savings could take a number of different, or can happen a number of ways. One of the things, as you mentioned, Max, is you could just tax, right? Like have a big consumption tax that makes it very difficult for people very costly for people to consume. But some countries actually just put huge taxes on imports so that there's very little for people to buy, right? So, if you think about an economy, particularly a small economy, you can't make everything. So if you're devoting so much of your resources to public investment, you basically reduce the number of consumer goods that people can buy. And so when they don't have access to consumer goods, they're kind of forced to save. And so this was the policy that's followed in many countries. You might think about this as kind of a Soviet model. So in the old Soviet Union, you basically, goods were rationed, right? Goods were rationed. Actually, you could think about it as a Soviet model, or you could think about it about a model of like what happened in the US during World War II, right? That so much of production was devoted to the military that the government decided we were going to ration consumer goods. So that rationing consumer goods is also a model of forced savings, because you're really telling people you cannot consume, right? You're limiting the amount of consumption that they can do. forcing them to save, right? So the Soviet Union did this for years and years. The US did this, and many other countries did this during World War II, right? I mean, one way you could think about the rationing model is a model of forced savings. And so here the idea was, no, we don't want people spending things on consumer goods or higher quality food or whatever. We just need to build investment, invest, right? And so, countries began to dramatically increase their domestic investment, dramatically cut back on things like social welfare spending, right? So the idea here is if you have money, it's better to build a road than, for instance, spend money on healthcare. Right? A road is investment, and that's going to make you rich. Spending money on healthcare or welfare is just money that's wasted. I think there's one other policy implication of all this that's worth talking about, and that is a debt boom, right? This idea that you need to invest to grow was also an idea that you need to borrow to grow. All right, so borrowing, any amount of money that you could borrow, you should do it, because if investment so directly increases growth, it will pay for itself, right? And I think that was the thinking of many policymakers. Sure, borrow all you can, put it into investment, it will lead to growth, it pays for itself. Go for it. How'd this work out? How did this work out in the 60s and early 70s? Did all these countries that dramatically increased their investment, did they see a boom in growth? No. There was no boom in growth, right? There is no correlation between investment rates and growth. In fact, if you look at Asia, one of the things that we see in Asia was that investment went down and growth went up during this period. Yeah, if I can show you this. Hold on one second. Just let me show you a graph of this. This is actually a graph from your book. But look here at investment rates in some newly industrialized countries. These are primarily Asian countries. Notice here, like a country like Taiwan, right? They had high investment rates in the 1960s, but these investment rates dramatically tailed off in the 1970s and 1980s, the period of fastest growth in Taiwan, right? Just when growth was taking off in Taiwan, investment rates started to plunge. Likewise, you look at Hong Kong here, right? I mean, investment rates kind of, flat or falling. Singapore, all over the place. Very little correlation between growth and investment. More than that, what's the correlation between getting financial aid and growth, or foreign aid and growth? Is it the countries that grow the fastest that get the most foreign aid? No, no. In fact, once again, we really see the opposite relationship. The slowest growing countries get the most foreign aid. And aid does not jumpstart growth, unlike what the Harrod-Dormer model said. So the Harrod-Dormer was saying you give countries aid and that's going to jumpstart growth. There was no jumpstart. Those countries that were not growing continued not to grow. While many countries that receive very little foreign aid, and here specifically talking about many of those Asian countries I just showed you, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, were not countries that were huge recipients of foreign aid, and yet those were the countries that were growing, right? So there's just not a lot of causation here, and not nearly the causation that the Harrod-Dormer model would predict. What's the problem with the Harrod-Dormer model? What's this Harrod-Dormer model missing?
It's missing incentives, like how to actually use the investment.
Yes. It's not always what you have, it's what you do with it. And this was a lesson that was learned time and time again in these big foreign aid public investment strategies, these public investment projects that have failed time and time again in places like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Where during the 60s and 70s, big foreign corporations came in and they would build a huge dam or they build a big road. And then what happens after the dam gets built or the road gets built? They leave. Now when they're gone, what's left to the country? To run the dam and to maintain the road. What don't they do? Know how to run the dam, know how to maintain the road, right? In fact, there was a report from the World Bank a few years ago that I thought I liked the title. The title said, "Trillions of dollars to build, zero to maintain." And that was, in many ways, the story of these big public investment projects during the 60s and 70s, where these huge lavish things would get built. But the problem is many of these countries simply didn't have either the incentives or the ability to really run them. They didn't have the human capital, they didn't have the people, or there was corruption, or there was theft, or there just simply wasn't any reason for people to really care. This will become a big part of our discussion of growth here as we get into next week, right? Next week, we're going to talk a lot about this concept of institutions. Okay, institutions, and what do we mean by economic institutions? Institutions obviously can mean a lot of different things, but in terms of growth, what we mean by institutions is the incentives created by society and government to engage in productive behavior and not theft. Okay? So the incentives that are created by society and government to engage in productive behavior and not theft. As we're going to talk about, in some ways, the entire history of economic growth really gets down to what incentives did people have to make and what incentive do people have to take. To the extent that your society and your government creates incentives to make things, you can create the conditions for economic growth. But to the extent that society encourages you to get rich simply by taking, you're not going to create sustained economic growth. And so if you think about a lot of these big public infrastructure projects, they were built, but none of the institutions that existed in that country changed. And so outsiders come in, they build this big dam, and then what happens the second they leave? This just becomes a huge opportunity for corruption, right? Where people get bought off, materials go missing, the money that's allocated for maintenance goes into people's pockets, and before you know it, the dam crumbles and you have a flood, right? This has happened time and time again. Without changing the institutions, the money just essentially goes to waste. And so, this is really, in very many ways, the unfortunate economic history, or the important the development history of the 60s and 70s, which was largely disastrous because it was very much a top-down kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of Robin Hood approach to economic development, right? There was this belief, I think, among a lot of policymakers, many of them well-intentioned, that poor countries are poor because they got screwed over by rich countries. And so what should rich countries do? Go in and give them money so they can become rich. And I wish it was that simple, right? I wish it was so simple that we could just give foreign aid to poor countries and they could become rich. But it's not that simple, right? To a very large extent, how rich you are depends upon what you do, the conditions that exist in your country, right? The incentives that exist. And so without changing those incentives to make versus take, a lot of this money just was simply wasted, right? It was simply wasted. So yes, that's a big reason, right? Why a lot of this money got wasted. I do think there's a second reason. And this one I think we should understand even better based on all our discussion of Solow here. What would Solow think about the Harrod-Dormer model? Can you get rich just through investment? Why not? What's the problem with trying to get rich through investment alone? Chase.
You're subject to diminishing marginal returns.
Yeah. DMR, right? You can't get rich just by increasing investment alone. Okay. Investment cannot drive in growth alone. Okay. Capital is a relatively small part of growth. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute because I think this is the point that needs to be made, maybe a little bit more clearly than I've made it here over the last couple of days. Capital is a relatively small part of growth. It has to be. Why? Because of the nature of production. Let me show you a figure here. okay? This is looking at capital share of national income. So what this is this is really an estimate of alpha in our Cobb-Douglas production function. What alpha is, how important capital is in production. Notice here that, yes, there are some countries where capital share comes to close to 0.5, but on average, capital is only about 1/3 of production. Right? And in the US, it's probably even lower than that. Though, as we're going to talk about, there's some reason to think it's actually going up over time. So the data really tells us that capital share is only at most, or roughly, about 1/3 of total output. And labor share is much bigger. So how are you going to grow by only increasing the part of production that contributes 1/3 of output? Very, very hard. If I can give you an analogy here, think about making pancakes, right? And let's say your pancakes have flour and butter and salt in them, okay? Obviously, flour is the biggest ingredient, followed by butter, and you just put a little bit of salt. Now, you make up a batch of pancake batter, and then you decide, ooh, I think I need some more. Can you stretch out that pancake batter by adding more flour? Yeah, you can, but it's subject to diminishing marginal returns, right? There's a limit to how much you can stretch it out. But it's a lot easier to create more pancake batter by adding more flour because flour is the biggest part of making a pancake. Can you make more pancake batter by adding more salt? No, because salt is a very small part of the pancake batter. And that's essentially, you have to think about capital the same way, right? You can't really increase the size of output by adding investment or capital because capital is a relatively small part of the recipe. A much bigger part of the recipe, and this is what we're going to talk about after we take a break, a much bigger part of the recipe is technology and labor, right? Technology and labor are the big parts of the recipe. And so, you know, capital is highly subject to diminishing returns. The fact that it's a relatively small part of production means it's going to be harshly subject to diminishing marginal returns. And we see that in the data, right? We see that in the data. So why don't we take a break here, and then I want to talk about what the data actually shows us about how important capital is relative to labor, relative to productivity, okay? So let's just keep a pretty short break because we don't have that much time, so maybe like 10-10, right? So take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about growth accounting. Okay, see you in a couple minutes. All right, everyone. Okay. So let's kind of continue this discussion here by moving to talking about what's called growth accounting. Growth accounting. And so this is an empirical discussion. How can you break break growth into its components? Capital, labor, and productivity. Can we actually say which of these is most important, right? Which of these is most important? What's happening to each of these over time, right? So this is an empirical question here that we're talking about. Can the data, right? Can we observe in the data how important capital is to growth, how important labor growth is to growth, how important productivity growth is to growth, okay? So this is how Solow did it. And this is actually a paper, I believe, in 1959. So basically, after he did his Solow model, he actually had a paper where he said, you know, you can, looking at the data, we can actually think about this question of how important capital is, labor is, and productivity is. So what Solow said is, let's use this production function. This one is a little different than the production function that we talked about before. Okay? So notice here, I don't have A that's directly contributing to L. I have B, which is contributing both to capital and labor. B here we can think of, really this has a lot of different names in the literature. Sometimes this is called the Solow residual, or multi-factor productivity, or total factor productivity. Okay. So in the literature, in papers that you read, you might come across this term Solow residual, or multi-factor productivity, or total factor productivity. They're really kind of all referring to the same thing here. That in this Solow, in this production function, there's really three ways that you can increase output. You can increase output through increasing capital, you can increase output through increasing labor, or you can increase productivity, right? Multi-factor productivity. So let's rewrite this in per capita terms, just like we've done before, right? We did this before. In per capita terms, this production function becomes this. And then we can write it in growth rates, meaning we take the logs and then we differentiate. And we can write it like this. Okay, Solow says, here's what we can do. We have data on this. We actually have data on capital. We have data on alpha. What don't we have data on? Productivity. We can't observe this directly. We can't observe total factor productivity. But here's the good news. We can calculate this as a residual, meaning if I take y and I subtract out alpha times k dot k, what's left over is total factor productivity. That's the reason why it's sometimes known as the Solow residual, right? It's the Solow residual. Let's be clear here. What B dot B is it's really It's the portion of output growth not explained by capital and labor, right? So as we're going to talk about, this is really important. Understanding this is really important to understanding what the solo residual can and cannot tell us. It's really saying, what's part of growth can't we explain? That's what we're going to call total factor productivity. The part of growth that we can't explain, that's what we're going to call total factor productivity. And so Solo went through US data and actually calculated what extent can we say that growth was driven by capital, labor, and then of course the residual total factor productivity or multi-factor productivity. So let's look at some data here. Sorry. My computer closed out right before class, so I forgot to pull up all this stuff. Sorry, everybody, hold on. Let me find my notes. I want to show you a figure, but I put it in a file. Now I can't remember where I saved it. Ah, damn it. What in the world did I do? Oh, this is so annoying. All right, just talk amongst yourselves. I'll find this table here somewhere. Hey, I did it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let's try this one more time. Okay, this is a version of the table that's shown in your book, but it has more recent data. So, I'm gonna blow this up. Okay, everybody see this? This is table 6.2, growth accounting. So let's go through this table and see if we can understand what this is telling us about the sources of growth. Let's look at the first column. This is looking at the entire period between 1948 and 2014. This is still not the right table, but anyway, this is good enough. Actually, the table I have has growth up to 2019, but I don't know what I did with that. All right, so here we see output per hour. So instead of measuring this as per capita output, it's actually measured at output per hour. And we see that output per hour grew at about 2.4%. Of that, about 0.9% can be attributed to capital. About 0.2% can be attributed to labor, and about 1.3% can be attributed to total factor productivity. Okay, it says A there, but we're using the B, right? That's B in our model. So what's the immediate takeaway from this? More than half of growth is attributable to total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is responsible for most of growth. Capital accounts for about 40% of growth. Labor, only about 10%. Why is labor so small? The reason is because when you talk about labor, you're talking about humans, right? So most of this labor contribution of capital is caused by changes in like things like labor force participation. But those change very, very slowly over time, right? So labor force participation has gone up in the United States over this period. Almost all of that contribution of labor is because of an increase in the labor force participation rate. But it changes very, very slowly. And you'll see that throughout this entire period is that the labor force just doesn't change very, very fast. As a result, the labor force cannot be a huge driver of growth, right? Particularly over relatively short periods of time. What does drive growth is total factor productivity. That's the key thing, right? That's the key thing. And so this data really, really emphasizes the point that most growth is caused by productivity, and productivity is largely driven by technology, right? And so just reemphasizes that point that was made in the Solow model. Now, there's some other interesting things, though, to be gleaned from this table, particularly if you look at individual periods, right? If you look at kind of the sub-periods, you'll see some interesting stories here. And these are stories that, quite honestly, economists are still trying to understand. First off, let's look at this period, 1948 to 1973. This was a period of very, very strong growth in the US. This is basically the early post-war period. So you'll notice that output per hour went up to 3.3. What drove that? Almost all of it was driven by an increase in total factor productivity. So this period is often referred to as the productivity boom period. For whatever reason, productivity was much stronger during this period, and as a result, output growth was much stronger. But then you had the period 1973 to 1995. This you could call the productivity slowdown period. Notice that output growth was much lower between 73 and 95. Why? Once again, driven almost entirely by a slowdown in total factor productivity. Why did total factor productivity slow down? Quite honestly, we don't know. As economists, we do not have a completely persuasive story for why total factor productivity has slowed down in this era. Then you have the 1995 to 2007 period, where output growth was high again and total factor productivity growth was high. And finally, you have the 2007 to essentially 2020 period. What have we seen? Slower output growth, slower total factor productivity growth. Why? Don't know. We just don't have a completely persuasive explanation for why total factor productivity growth is so variable. And, oh, I didn't mean to do that. If I can show you, yeah. Hold on, I want to show you another figure if I can find it. Sorry about this clunky presentation here. Well, I can't find anything now. I need to get my act together. But basically, it was a graph of what total factor productivity looks like. It's very volatile, right? It's very volatile, okay? You don't need a graph to really kind of understand that. It's volatile. And so, this is a key question in economics. And it's a question in which a bunch of research is always being done. And in fact, if this is a topic that interests you, this is a topic where you can find lots of interesting research of economists trying to figure out why the total factor productivity slow down. Right? Trying to understand that. But we, as I said, we don't really quite understand. Remember, total factor productivity is a residual. As a result, it is, in essence, it is everything we can't measure. So what goes into total factor productivity? A lot. And we, honestly, I think economists are constantly struggling with this. How do we understand all the things that have shown up in total factor productivity, right? It is a kitchen sink measure. And so economists are working on trying to understand this. But we don't. We still don't quite understand why productivity was lower during the 70s. Let alone, we don't really understand why productivity is slower today. Let me talk about some hypotheses. And some of this we're going to come back and talk to a little bit later in class. One of the co-authors of your book has written another book last year, basically talking about why the productivity slowed down, right? And so we'll actually come back a little bit later in class and talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail. But let's talk about some of the hypotheses and some things that have some evidence for them, although most of this doesn't have definitive evidence. Many people have talked about government policy. For instance, the fact that the government's more intrusive, or government regulation, or taxes. I'm going to put this in the unlikely category. And the reason why it's hard to think about government policy as being a cause of the slowdown is because it's happening across the globe. One of the things we observe is that this same slowdown is happening not just in the US, but it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Asia. Wherever we have reasonable data, we're observing this slowdown. And so that suggests it's not because of government policy, because obviously not every country in the world follows the same policy, right? So government policy is unlikely. Many people have talked about the problem that maybe new technology is not really productive. And by this, I mean, what's our new form of new forms of technology? Well, cooler smartphones that allow us to do Instagram posts and game more effectively. Well, that's great, right? It's nice to be able to have a new Xbox. The problem is that's not really increasing productivity. In fact, in many ways, it might be reducing productivity, right? So there is an argument. I personally don't really buy this, but there have been arguments that really a lot of productivity is about consumption, not production. As I say, I kind of discount this a little bit, but you know, I think that's just me. Moving on to things that I think have more predictive power, right, or that have more evidence to support them. There is definitely a reason to think that some of this is related to demographic changes across the globe. In the US and many other countries, we have aging populations. We have lower birth rates. More retirees. And as a result, we also have slower growth in educational attainment. So if you look at, for instance, the number of years of schooling for the average American, this continues to go up, but the pace at which it goes up has really slowed, in part because of demographic changes, right? There's not a lot of 50 or 60-year-old people who are in college, right? Or getting their PhDs. And so as a result, these demographic changes, the argument is that older people contribute less to new innovation and to new increases in productivity. And, you know, I think there's some evidence for this, right? And we'll, like I said, when we talk about the Vollrath book, we'll maybe go into this in a little bit more detail. But I do think that there is some evidence that part of what's going on in the US and in particularly other countries, because, you know, to be honest with you, demographics in the US actually look pretty good to the demographics of what's going on in many European countries or places like Japan, in part because we have immigration, right? This is one of the great saving graces of immigration is actually slowing these demographic changes relative to places like Japan, where they have a rapidly aging population. And there it's definitely creating a negative impact on their ability to increase productivity because they just have older and older people and fewer people working. The move to a service economy is probably playing a big role in this. What's the thing about a service economy? It's more labor intensive. And what's the thing about labor? It's harder to increase the productivity, right? How are you going to increase the productivity of a yoga instructor? Well, I mean, there's ways you can do it, but it's hard, right? Many of the services that we increasingly want, right, are hard to increase their productivity. Why have we moved to a service-based economy? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but part of it is we've become so productive at manufacturing that we need very few people to make the physical things that we need. So more and more we spend money on services. And there is some argument that it's harder, in part because humans subject to diminishing marginal returns, right? You can give us more and more capital that will increase our productivity, but not by a lot, right? You can give me 2 computers or 3 computers, but what's the ultimate limit on how productive I am? How fast I think, how fast I type, right? There are physical limits to these things. I think something else that economists have talked about, and I've become quite persuaded that this is a big part of it, is economic inequality. that economic inequality is actually reducing our aggregate productivity. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in class. We'll spend part of a day talking about inequality in more detail. But, oh, hold on one second. Okay. I'm being told the inauguration is starting here in a minute, so I've got to wrap it up. All right. Which I will in a couple minutes. So inequality, right? How is inequality impacting productivity? Well, as I said, I'll talk more about this in detail. But it's impacting, for instance, our ability to get a quality of education, right? One of the things that we know is that the quality of education that rich people get is much better than the quality of education that poor people get. And as a result, this is one of the things that's reducing educational attainment, is because people that are poor are having a harder time actually getting an education. Something else is intergenerational mobility. We see increasingly that poor people stay poor and rich people stay rich. One of the more shocking facts of economic inequality is that, do you know that in the United States, the correlation between a parent's height and a kid's height is lower than the correlation between a parent's income and a kid's income? Right? Income is more highly correlated than height across generations in the United States. That tells you a lot, because we know that ability is not nearly as correlated across incomes or across generations. So there's a lot of privilege, either people that have it or people that don't, that impacts how productive people can be in our modern economies. And that is likely creating a drag on growth when you have big segments of the economy that really cannot participate in creating new innovation and new productivity in the way that they should, because they don't have access to the resources that are needed to do it. So, total factor productivity, we know it's important, but the interesting thing is here is we really have a lot of ignorance about it, right? I mean, this is really an area where economists are trying to struggle to figure things out. Just as an example of this, if I can show you, this is just from the Economist magazine this week. Can you see this? It says the new era of innovation. This showing up for you? New era of innovation. Why a dawn of technological optimism is breaking, right? So here's an article in The Economist that's saying, no, look. Total factor productivity is finally going to go up, right? It's finally going to go up. And so, you know, they're making the argument that no, maybe now it's time for a swing in total factor productivity again. If you read through this article, I can actually, maybe I'll send this to you in the email of the day. This article really talks about a couple of reasons why maybe we could be more optimistic about technology and total factor productivity in the future. The first is that there really are some transformative technologies out there. For those of you who've been keeping up with the COVID vaccine, you might have read a little bit about what's called messenger RNA, which is a completely novel way of trying to create a vaccine that can fight a wide range of not just communicative diseases, but maybe a number of other diseases that we're subject to. So, you know, these kind of innovations and the fact that we were able to move this so quickly, some people are saying, well, you know, this could have a wide range of applications that make people healthier, and healthier people will be more productive. They talk about the boom in investment in technology, which is true. If you look at the data, there is some evidence that companies are spending more money on technology and research and development than they have over the last 20 years. In part because maybe they're seeing more direct productivity benefits from these new innovations, such as robotics. And then the third source of optimism in this article is that one of the things that maybe society and definitely companies have gotten better at is taking a new technology and getting it rolled out, meaning actually using it. That companies have figured out over time not just how to innovate, but how to actually implement innovation in quicker ways. So things such as e-commerce, and we've seen a lot of this during COVID, right? How quickly many companies have evolved to selling online, to doing digital payments online, right? And so, they're kind of pointing to, you look at what's happened here in COVID, maybe that's an indicator of how life will be in the future. All I can say is, I really don't know, right? And I don't really think most economists know, right? We can hypothesize, we can point, but to some level, we know that total factor productivity is so important, but yet our ability to predict it in the near term is really, really limited because it's just very, very complicated. So we'll continue to come back and talk about total factor productivity as we go along and talk about other topics. But yeah, this is one of those areas where you win a Nobel Prize in economics, right? I mean, this is where a lot of the best minds are working. And so if this is a topic that's interesting to you, this is definitely an area where you can find a lot of interesting articles. Tend to be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more quantitative because this is an empirical question. But you can find, a lot of interesting research in this area. And so think about that, if that's something that interests you for your literature review paper. All right, well, I think we should go. If you want to watch the swearing in, right? If you want to participate in the National Civics Day, please go do it. So remember, no class this afternoon. Tomorrow, I'll send you an email, but we're going to be talking about human capital and education. That's going to be the big topic of class tomorrow. Also, tomorrow afternoon, Megan Yamanishi from the library is going to come talk to us about how to begin doing a little research for our literature review. Okay, so that would be the big things tomorrow. An email will be forthcoming, okay? All right, have a good afternoon, y'all. Enjoy your time off.